Hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about natural kinds. Much of our knowledge of the world involves classifying the entities in the world into kinds. When we investigate the world, we don't just find lots of individual things. These individuals are grouped into kinds. I'm currently recording this on a computer, and there are lots of other computers in the world. I have a glass of water beside me. There is much more water in the world. Now, most conceivable classifications of entities are entirely arbitrary, right? You could just group entities together completely randomly. I might take the Pacific Ocean, my mobile phone, Socrates' beard, and the first laser beam. That's a completely random jumble of items. Most classifications that we use are not totally arbitrary like this, but many sort of classification schemes that we have do reflect our interests and our particular state of knowledge. So consider the set of red objects, for example, or the set of Japanese chairs, or weeds, or edible foods, or the stellar constellations. The set of red objects, or the set of Japanese chairs, those aren't simply arbitrary sets, but they are dependent on us in a sense. There isn't much that we can say about red objects in general, beyond the fact that they all appear red to normal humans in normal conditions. Knowing that an object is red doesn't tell us much else about the object, because red objects have very few properties in common. Red flowers, red paper, red stones, red blood cells. What do these have in common beyond being red? Very little. They share redness, and they share properties that are connected with or dependent on redness, but that's all. Red objects form a highly heterogeneous set. By contrast, the natural kinds are supposed to reflect natural divisions. They are based on the objective structure of the world, rather than on groupings that happen to be interesting or important to humans. All the members of a natural kind will have indefinite numbers of properties in common. So to quote John Stuart Mill, he says, 100 generations have not exhausted the common properties of animals or of plants, of sulphur or phosphorus, nor do we suppose them to be exhaustible, but proceed to new observations and experiments in the full confidence of discovering new properties which were by no means implied in those we previously knew. So all the samples of sulphur have a whole host of common properties, an indefinite number of common properties, and we can make far more reliable generalizations about things made of sulphur than we can about red things in general. So the natural kinds are discovered, not invented or imposed upon nature. They're not dependent on us. If you take, for instance, the stellar constellations, well, clearly it's up to us how those stars are grouped together. We could have drawn the lines in different places, and there's no fact of the matter how to group stars into constellations. Similarly, the collection of objects that we recognise as red objects is dependent on the idiosyncrasies of our visual system and our colour language. Organisms with different visual systems, societies with different colour terms, will group colours differently. And again, it doesn't seem like any of these groupings is correct or incorrect. A dog won't sort of identify the same objects as red that we do. That a dog will have a different colour classification system, but it doesn't seem like either the dog or the human is right or wrong about how they classify colour. On the other hand, take the chemical elements, which are organised by atomic number, by the number of protons in the nucleus. This classification scheme seems to be tracking a real division in nature itself. A further point here is that natural kinds are often thought to ground inductive inferences and generalizations. So take the claim, all copper conducts electricity. All observed samples of copper conduct electricity. They're conductive due to certain underlying properties of the copper. And since copper is a natural kind, we're justified in thinking that all samples of copper, even those we haven't yet observed, will share these underlying properties, so will be conductive as well. All samples of copper can be expected to share a host of other properties too, such as melting point, colour, and types of interactions with other materials, and so on. So hopefully this gives you an intuitive sense of what philosophers mean when they talk about natural kinds. But there are a variety of different accounts of natural kinds in the literature. So, under what conditions does a classification system pick out the natural kinds? Well, the most stringent account of natural kinds is given by essentialism, which we will examine in this video. Okay, essentialism claims that there is some intrinsic property or set of intrinsic properties whose possession is necessary and sufficient for being a member of a kind. So, all and only members of the natural kind will possess these intrinsic properties. This property is these properties is the essence of the kind. The essence of the kind causes the other properties of the kind and governs how the members of the kind interact with other kinds. And this allows us to formulate general, universal laws about the behaviour of the kind. Again, chemical elements provide the classic example that's used to defend essentialism. Chemical elements are distinguished by the number of protons in the nucleus. Hydrogen is a single proton, helium is 2 protons, and so on. The atomic number of an element determines how it interacts with other elements and the kinds of bonds it can form and the processes it can undergo. Now, a useful discussion of essentialism is given by Elliot Sober in his paper Evolution, Population Thinking and Essentialism. He focuses on essentialism in biology, but I think his discussion is just quite useful for essentialism in general. So Sober says that the essentialist account of natural kinds involves 3 claims. So the first claim is that there are certain properties that are shared by all and only members of the kind, and indeed by all and only the possible members of the kind, not just those that actually exist. So all and only helium atoms have 2 protons in the nucleus. 2 protons in the nucleus is a necessary and sufficient condition for being a helium atom. Now, in itself, satisfying this condition is actually quite trivial, because it's, so for instance, it's necessarily true that a helium atom is a helium atom. All and only helium atoms are helium atoms. Similarly, we can construct other properties that are necessarily possessed by all and only the helium atoms. If it's impossible for perpetual motion machines to exist, as thermodynamics would tell us, then it's necessarily true that something is a helium atom just in case it's either a helium atom or a perpetual motion machine. So Sober says, in order to avoid these kind of trivial examples like this, we need a further criterion of essentialism, which is that the membership condition must be explanatory. The properties that are shared by members of the kind must be explanatory. So we need to specify some property or properties shared by all and only the helium atoms that explain why helium is the way it is. And that's the essence of helium. So essentialism involves a particular kind of explanation. All samples of helium are composed of atoms with 2 protons, but the crucial point is that this atomic number explains why helium has the properties that it does. It explains why it behaves the way that it does. Now, there is, of course, a lot of diversity in the behaviour of helium. As you can find, if you place helium in different environments with different temperatures and pressures, that will alter the behaviour of helium in myriad ways. But underlying this diversity of behaviour is the number of protons. And this shared property explains the behaviour of helium in all sorts of different circumstances. For instance, helium is the least reactive element. The explanation of this appeals to helium's complete electron shell, which is in turn explained by its atomic number, because the number of electrons in an atom is the same as the number of protons. And also note that the atomic number is an intrinsic property of the atom. The number of protons in the nucleus doesn't depend on the environment of the atom. Okay, third, Sober says that in the case of a natural kind is defined in terms of its members. He calls this a constituent definition. So the thought here is that the properties of the kind helium, that's determined by the helium atoms, right? Once we understand the properties of the helium atoms, we understand the properties of the kind. Indeed, you can learn about a kind by just studying a single member. You can sort of study a single helium atom and learn its essential property, and then you know the properties of all the other members of the kind. So kinds are sort of defined in terms of their parts. Helium is just that which is composed of helium atoms, and a helium atom is an atom containing 2 protons in the nucleus. So the essentialist is committed to a kind of reductionism, that, you know, like a higher level entity such as a canister of helium gas. The helium gas there is going to be defined in terms of the lower level entities, the atoms. And as I say, you know, you can understand the essential properties of all of the helium atoms in that canister by just looking at a single helium atom and finding its essence, its essential property, which in this case would be the atomic number. Okay, now a fourth point that I think is worth drawing attention to. Sober himself is sceptical that essentialists need to be committed to this, but it's commonly associated with essentialism. And this is what we might call categorical distinctness. For any given object, it needs to be clear what kind it is. It needs to be clear what its essence is. There need to be clear, significant gaps between natural kinds. So an important feature of the chemical elements is that they are wholly discrete. There are sharp and significant boundaries between each element. Even when the atomic number differs only by 1, the properties of the elements will be completely different. The atomic number of gold is 79, the atomic number of mercury is 80, but gold and mercury have very different properties. And the same is true for any 2 elements whose atomic numbers differ only by 1. There's no vagueness. Now this is important because essentialists, more so than anybody else, insist that natural kinds are objective, they are discovered, not invented. There are objective distinctions that exist in nature. Now where you have smooth, continuous variation, drawing the lines between the different classes is necessarily somewhat arbitrary. Think about how we group colours together, and we have to draw a line between red and pink. Where exactly does red become pink? I mean, there's no objective answer to this. Some colours are determinately red and others are determinately pink, but there's still a vague boundary. And so when we draw the line, it's partially up to us where to put it. You know, people can disagree on this without either of them being right or wrong, because you know, there's clearly an element of arbitrariness in where we put the line. Where you have categorical distinctness, you have an objective criterion for drawing the line. Or we might even say that the line is drawn by nature itself. Okay then, so that's the commitments of essentialism. Now in modern philosophy, essentialism is often taken to be supported by an account of meaning that's associated with Hilary Putnam and Saul Kripke, and we'll focus in particular on Putnam's views. I won't go into too much detail on this because, well, I guess this is really more a topic for philosophy of language, but it's important to outline briefly because this has been quite influential in the literature on essentialism. So Putnam's account of meaning is most intuitively applied to proper names. So we'll talk about proper names first and then move on to kinds. Take the name Paul Feyerabend. This name refers to a particular person, that person, right? So that is the person to whom the name Paul Feyerabend refers. Now, there are all kinds of descriptions associated with the name Paul Feyerabend. For instance, the writer of Against Method, a philosopher of science who worked at the University of California, Berkeley, and so on, right? You know, these are just descriptions of the features of Paul Feyerabend. So according to Putnam, the name Paul Feyerabend does not refer on the basis of these descriptions, because somebody who knows hardly anything about Feyerabend, indeed somebody who has lots of incorrect beliefs about Feyerabend, could still refer to Paul Feyerabend by using this name, right? I mean, somebody might not really know anything about him. I might, for instance, mention the name Paul Feyerabend to someone who doesn't even study philosophy, and then they say, oh, who's Paul Feyerabend? And the thought is that when they say who's Paul Feyerabend, even though they don't know any of the anything about Feyerabend, they don't know any of the descriptions associated with the name Paul Feyerabend, they would still be referring to that guy whose picture we just saw. So Putnam accounts for this by proposing a causal theory of reference. His idea is that a name is given to a person by an initial dubbing event or an initial baptism. And this doesn't need to be anything sophisticated, right? Usually this will just involve something like somebody pointing to a baby and saying, that baby is called Paul Feyerabend. Or maybe not even that, you know. But anyway, so there's this dubbing event where somebody gives a name to a person. Then this name is passed from person to person. You know, somebody else will ask, oh, what's that baby called? Oh, the baby's called Paul, etc. And then somebody says, oh, you know, did you see what Paul did? And other people start talking about Paul. So the name is passed from person to person. And each person who uses the name Paul Feyerabend then refers to Paul Feyerabend in virtue of their usage being part of a causal chain that extends back to the initial dubbing event. So this is known as a causal theory of reference, because, you know, the name refers in virtue of this causal chain going back to the dubbing. The initial dubbing hooks the name to the person, and then when other people use the name, that hook remains in place. It's like the hook to the person is passed from person to person as the name is passed. You know, as the name is passed from person to person, the hook is passed with it. So even if somebody has various false beliefs about Paul Feyerabend, they will still refer to Paul Feyerabend in virtue of this hook that has been in place since the dubbing. So anyway, that's proper names. Now, Putnam's basic idea is that kind terms like tiger, gold, water, you know, terms that refer to kinds, work very much like proper names. Putnam distinguishes between what he calls the stereotype and the extension of a kind term. So let's take the term water. Well, the stereotype is a description of the conventional understanding of what water is like. So it would be something like, you know, clear, colourless, liquid at room temperature, falls from the sky, necessary for survival, and so on. The stereotype lists the features generally associated with water. In the same way, you know, you could sort of list the features that you associate with Paul Feyerabend. You could list the descriptions that you think are true of Paul Feyerabend. The extension of the term is simply the set of all objects in the world to which the term applies. Now, just as the reference of the name Paul Feyerabend is not determined by the descriptions associated with the name, so the extension of a kind term is not determined by the stereotype. Rather, the extension is determined by a dubbing event and then the causal chains that follow it. So, again, there is this initial dubbing event. Somebody lifts up a glass of liquid and they say, this liquid is called water. Now, the liquid in that glass was in fact H2O. So, any substance that is H2O is water. Water is therefore necessarily H2O. H2O is the essential property of water. And as new people start using the term water, they refer to H2O also, in virtue of the fact that their use is part of a causal chain extending back to this dubbing event where a person first dubbed a bunch of H2O molecules to be called water. So an important point here is we might have no idea about what the underlying properties of water are, or we might be mistaken about these underlying properties. We might mistakenly believe that the chemical structure of water is H2C. Even so, water refers to H2O because the stuff in the glass, the stuff that was actually in the glass, when I held it up and said this liquid is called water, that stuff had the chemical structure H2O. So we can use a kind term successfully, even if the stereotype of the term is wrong. And this means that we can investigate a kind and discover its essential properties. We might be wrong about the essential properties. We can investigate it and discover. And of course we did discover that water was in fact, that water was H2O. We didn't know that from the start. That required scientific investigation. Putnam's most famous argument for this view rests on what's known as his twin Earth thought experiment. Putnam asks us to imagine a twin Earth, a place that is identical to Earth in almost every respect, except that what the twin Earthlings call water, the substance that they drink, that fills their oceans, that falls from the sky from it rains, that has all the observable properties of water, this substance actually doesn't have the chemical composition H2O, but some entirely new chemical composition XYZ. Now, given our current physical and chemical knowledge, this is impossible, but it's just a thought experiment, so go with it. Let's imagine that this happens. Putnam claims that in this situation we would say that this substance on twin Earth is not really water, even though in terms of its observable properties it's exactly the same as water. It seems to be exactly the same as water. Putnam says no, actually intuitively we would say that it's not water. So to put it somewhat technically, XYZ, the twin Earth stuff, that fits the stereotype of the term water, but it does not fall under its extension. And the reason for this is water is necessarily H2O. The essence of water is H2O. So our term water cannot refer to this XYZ substance. When we say water, and when twin Earthlings say water, we're each referring to different natural kinds. If we were to visit twin Earth, we would initially think that the substance is water, but then on investigation we would discover that it's something very different. It's a different natural kind. The extension of a kind term is fixed by the microstructural properties of the entity or substance to which that term was first applied. And then these properties are discovered over the course of scientific investigation. So, the extension of the term water is just H2O, because the stuff to which we apply the term water has the chemical composition H2O. So even if there was some liquid on another planet that had all of the observable properties of water, it wouldn't really be water if the chemical composition turned out to be different. Okay, now there are a number of objections to Putnam's view. One of the primary objections is what's known as the qua problem. Now this problem is that any given object or sample will be a member of many different kinds. Some kinds are subkinds of broader kinds. So the standard example that's given here is, suppose I come across a new animal and I name it a schmat. Putnam tells us that, well, schmats are any objects that share the same essential properties as the original schmat. But of course the original schmat is a member of many different kinds. It's an animate object, an animate object with certain biochemistry, an animate object with certain structural properties. It's a member of a particular species, a member of a particular species with a particular age, and so on. So does the term schmat pick out the species or just the species members of a particular age? Similarly then, when I name a sample of liquid, when I point to a glass of liquid and say that stuff is called water, how do we determine exactly which kind is picked out? How do we determine whether water refers specifically to H2O rather than some broader class of microstructures of which H2O is one specific type? Obviously people couldn't have stipulated that water refers to the microstructure H2O because that structure wasn't even known when the term water first came into use. Now what makes this especially problematic is that we rarely have pure water. If I take a glass of seawater, it will contain about 3.5% salt, various other minerals, millions of bacteria and viruses. That's a very different composition from the water that comes out of my tap. And that difference matters in many contexts because I can't just drink seawater, for example. So when I take the glass of seawater and dub it water, why would that refer to H2O? Why not H2O with a 3.5% concentration of salt? Okay, a second objection. This is given by P.D. Magnus in his book Scientific Inquiry and Natural Kinds. Magnus asks whether Putnam's view even addresses the issue of natural kinds. Because Magnus says that what Putnam seems to be concerned about in the twin Earth example is how we should use the word water. But that's just not really an important issue from the point of view of studying natural kinds. Magnus says regardless of how we should use the word water, we need to recognise at least three natural kinds in the twin Earth example. There's H2O, which is one natural kind, there's XYZ, which is another natural kind, and then there's H2O plus XYZ, which together form a broader natural kind. These are three distinct kinds. And it doesn't really matter which kind the term water is applied to. That's not particularly important. So since H2O and XYZ are interchangeable in so many contexts, since they have precisely the same observable properties and it required very sophisticated scientific development to tell the difference between the two of them, well, they should surely count as a single kind, even if we must also make finer distinctions. By analogy, protium is the most common isotope of hydrogen. It consists of just one proton and no neutrons. Then there's deuterium, which consists of one proton and one neutron. Now, protium is a kind, deuterium is a kind, but hydrogen in general, which includes both protium and deuterium, is also a kind. Magnus suggests that the same would surely be true for H2O and XYZ. But both of these substances have indefinite numbers of properties in common. It hardly matters how we use the term water. It doesn't really matter whether we apply that term to just H2O or to both H2O and XYZ. The question is, what are the natural kinds? And it looks like we need to, draw at least three. We need to recognise at least three natural kinds here. And it also seems that, if we're asking what the natural kinds are, language use isn't going to answer that question. So we can't sort of answer that question just by looking at how we should use the term water. A final problem is, even if we just focus on normal earthly water, it's not clear that it has the kind of simple microstructure that Putnam suggests. Putnam assumes the standard view that water is H2O, which is perfectly fine as a simplification. But if you're claiming that this is describing the essence of water, there are some problems. The first problem here is that all samples of water will also contain other isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen, as I've just mentioned, it comes in the form not just of protium, but also deuterium. So water is not just H2O, it also contains, any sample of water will also contain a fraction of D2O. Second, even if you had a sample of water containing only H2O, purely protium and oxygen with, oxygen 16. Even if you had that, water isn't simply a collection of H2O molecules thrown together like a bunch of balls in a bag. The macroscopic properties of liquid water result from a host of complex interactions involving H2O, but also ions, hydrogen ions, hydroxide ions, hydronium ions, and this is due to what's known as the self-ionization of water. The water molecules will essentially keep swapping hydrogen atoms around. So when we say that water is H2O, that is a very useful simplification, but it is, arguably it is a simplification, right? It's not a specification of the essential property of water. Because in fact, a lot of what's going on in a glass of water, it's not just H2O. There's all these other ions. There's all this other stuff going on, and all sorts of complex interactions, and that's what produces the macroscopic properties of water. So it's actually very difficult to specify just what the microstructural properties of water are. Okay then, so those are a few issues with Putnam's view. We've seen that essentialism is maybe a plausible account of the chemical elements, and maybe also molecules like water molecules, although there are some issues with that. However, the general consensus among philosophers is that essentialism fails for higher level sciences. In particular, we'll focus on biology. Even many biologists have argued that biology refutes essentialism. For instance, Ernst Mayr, he was a biologist. He thinks biology refuted essentialism. So actually this is a topic that doesn't just occupy philosophers. So why is this? Why did essentialism fail in biology? Well, this is the main topic of Sober's paper that I mentioned earlier. That's Evolution, Population Thinking and Essentialism. Now, of course, I should say that there are still some people who defend essentialism in general, but I mean, I think there's a broad consensus that essentialism isn't going to work as an account of natural kinds in biology, and so we'll sort of assume that and then ask, why that is. Why is this? Why is there this general consensus that biology has refuted essentialism? Okay, so one idea is that essentialism is refuted by the plain fact of evolution. In biology, the basic taxonomic unit, the basic way of organising the living world, is the species. Organisms are grouped into species. Now, in the past, it was generally believed that species are fixed. Maybe it's true that some species go extinct while new ones are brought into existence by God, but in that case, the new species come into existence fully formed. You don't have one species gradually becoming another species. All species have certain fixed, unchangeable types. Evolutionary theory throws this out. We now know that the properties of species change over time. So does this undermine essentialism? Well, it's not entirely obvious why it would do. After all, transmutation of elements doesn't undermine essentialism in chemistry. The same atom can change from uranium to thorium, yet uranium and thorium are natural kinds, with all of the instances of these kinds sharing an essence. So if we look at a specific atom of uranium, we will find that its essence changes when it decays. So the mere fact of evolutionary change doesn't seem to be a problem for essentialism. A more plausible idea is that what undermines essentialism is not simply evolution, but gradualism, gradual evolution. As we noted earlier, many people hold that essentialism is committed to categorical distinctness. This is found in the chemical elements, where there is no gradual variation. A uranium atom decays into a thorium atom immediately, and it radically changes its properties immediately with no intermediate steps. This is of course not the case with species. New forms emerge only very slowly over thousands or millions of years, and you can't say where one species ends and another begins. Or at least you can't say exactly. You can't draw an exact line. Now, Sober himself is sceptical of this argument because he thinks that essentialism is in principle compatible with vague essences. An essence, according to Sober, just needs to be an intrinsic property universal to the kind that explains the behaviour of the kind. But there could be essences that change over time, gradually change over time. And that's controversial, but I think that maybe a more important point here is that even if you accept categorical distinctness, it's not clear that gradualism would be a problem, because natural kinds are specified within classification systems, and we can restrict the context of a classification system in such a way that species do exhibit categorical distinctness. Let's say we are studying an ecosystem over the course of a few years. We're looking at a specific ecosystem and looking at how it changes over the course of a couple of decades, say. Well, there will be substantial differences between two species of birds, say the crows and the toucans. Now, of course, if you look back across all evolutionary history over the entire planet, well, the crows and toucans will share a common ancestor, and the point at which they diverged will be vague. But in the context of our study, there is no vagueness at all. There is a clear objective distinction between crows and toucans. Here's a bit of a thought experiment. Suppose we were to discover that the universe has a special kind of evolutionary history, the universe as a whole. Suppose that matter, all matter, began as a kind of undifferentiated gloop, and then over time it differentiated into different individual things. So initially there were no separate protons, no separate elements, nothing like that. There was just this gloopy mass, and then over millions and millions of years, protons gradually emerged and gradually began organising themselves into elements. So if this picture were true, then when you look at the whole history of the universe, there would be no objective distinction between hydrogen and helium. The precise line between these elements would be vague. Now, would this undermine the essentialist account of chemical elements? It seems to me that it wouldn't. Because the point is, the point is that there is categorical distinctness now. The periodic table has categorical distinctness now. The fact that it didn't have that in the past doesn't change the fact that it does have it now. There's no vagueness, and it seems like we can still defend essentialism, as an account of chemical elements today. Again, so gradualism maybe isn't in itself the problem. Another potential challenge to essentialism in biology is that many philosophers of biology argue that species are not kinds at all, but rather individuals. An organism is not a member of a kind of species, rather it is a part of a larger biological individual. So I mean, a standard biological individual would be an organism, right? I'm a biological individual. Kane Baker names a biological individual. It would be very odd to think of all of the parts that I'm composed of, my heart, my lungs, my skin, my brain. It would be odd to think of this set of things as being a natural kind. I mean, arguably my heart is a member, arguably, of a natural kind, but it's a member of the natural kind human hearts. It's not a member of the natural kind parts of Kane Baker. Parts of Kane Baker is not a natural kind. Well, similarly, many philosophers hold that a species is an individual with the organisms as its parts. Michael Giselin and David L. Hull are the most famous exponents of this view. So why on earth should we think that species are not kinds, but individuals? Well, one argument here is that species evolve, but only only an individual can evolve. Kinds cannot evolve. An individual member of a kind might change. As we noted just a minute ago, an atom of uranium might decay into an atom of thorium. But in this case, the kind hasn't changed its properties. Rather, an individual atom was a member of one kind, and then this individual changed and became a member of a different kind. So the kind uranium and the kind thorium retain exactly the same intrinsic properties. All the remaining atoms of uranium retain the same atomic number, the same radioactive properties, the same kind of interactions with other elements. But this kind of thing isn't the case with species. With species, the species itself changes. Its properties change. Take Homo sapiens. Take any of the properties of this species, average height, average brain size, tolerance of lactose, whatever. Over tens of thousands of years, many of these properties will gradually change. So kinds cannot evolve, only individuals evolve, but a species evolves, so it must be an individual. A second argument is that species are spatiotemporally restricted. Imagine a species of horse-like organisms on another planet in the Andromeda Galaxy. Perhaps these organisms are exactly identical to horses on Earth, even down to the genomes. Still, they couldn't be horses, because they're not descended from the same ancestor as horses. They don't have the right history. Or similarly, suppose that horses were to go extinct in an asteroid impact, then suppose that 200 million years from now, new organisms were to develop that were exactly like horses, again, right down to the genomes. Again, these couldn't be horses, because they don't have the right kind of historical connection to horses. They would be a different horse-like species. Species have a history. Species are restricted to particular times and places. Natural kinds are not spatiotemporally restricted. Any atom composed of 92 protons is uranium, no matter where in the universe it occurs. And if all the atoms containing 92 protons somehow cease to exist, well, uranium would cease to exist. But then later, if atoms with 92 protons were brought into existence again, uranium would exist again. So species are fundamentally historical entities, natural kinds are not. Of course, the obvious objection to this particular argument is that it begs the question against those who hold that species are kinds. The defender of the species as kinds view might just say that species aren't spatiotemporally restricted, that if horses were destroyed by an asteroid impact, it's not conceptually impossible, although it is very unlikely, for horses to arise again later. So I mean, the worry here is that the spatiotemporal limitation of species is a consequence of, not an argument for, the view that species are individuals. But the more general problem with both of these arguments and with, I guess, appealing to this individuality thesis in this context is that they seem to rest on the assumption that there can't be what we might call historical kinds, that natural kinds can't have a history and can't change. But why not? I mean, obviously, there are differences between species on the one hand and paradigmatic natural kinds like elements on the other. They're not the same kinds of kinds, we might say, but maybe they're both natural kinds. I mean, it's clear that species exhibit some properties that are more commonly associated with individuals, but they also clearly have properties associated with kinds. Why couldn't a species be both an individual and a kind? I guess a more crucial point in the context of essentialism is that, well, maybe parts of individuals or certain parts of individuals share essential properties. Maybe essentialism can apply to certain types of individuals as well. So let's just assume that species are individuals and organisms are parts of species, not members of a kind. Well, what makes two organisms part of the same individual? In principle, it could be an essence that is shared by the two organisms. To return to the example given earlier, I'm a biological individual. My body is composed of billions of cells. What makes any two cells in my body parts of the same larger biological individual? Well, arguably, it's the fact that they share the same genome. And so we might argue that the genome is the essential property of the biological individual Cain Baker. So, although if we talk about parts of Cain Baker in general, these don't share any essential properties. If we're more specific and we consider cells of Cain Baker, these maybe do share an essence, at least arguably. Now, in fact, there are various problems with this view, primarily the fact that over time mutations will accumulate, so my cells don't actually all share the same genome, but in principle, it seems like the parts of an individual could share essential properties. So the fact that species are individuals wouldn't in itself challenge essentialism. Okay, let's turn to Elliot Sober's own explanation for why essentialism failed. According to Sober, essentialism is an explanatory hypothesis. It proposes a particular kind of explanation for natural phenomena, and this kind of explanation is just no longer used by biologists. In particular, the essentialist appeals to what Sober calls the Aristotelian natural state model to explain the variation found in nature. The natural state model was most famously applied in physics. Aristotle drew a distinction between the natural and non-natural states of an object. Non-natural states are produced when the object is subject to some interfering force. So in Aristotelian cosmology, the world contains 5 basic elements: earth, water, air, fire, and ether. The natural state of Earth is to be located at the centre of the cosmos, and this is followed by a sphere of water, and then a sphere of air, and then a sphere of fire, and finally a sphere of ether. Ether composes the celestial objects, the sun, moon, and stars. So, that's just a very simple kind of diagram for this. You have this cosmos of these concentric rings of substances, basically. Now, since the natural state of Earth is to be at the centre, earthly objects will naturally tend to fall. They will naturally tend to find their way to the centre. Similarly, watery objects will tend to organise themselves in a sphere around the Earth. All bodies naturally move towards their natural place. Now, of course, in many respects, the world deviates from this picture. Many heavy objects are not located at the centre of the Earth. I might throw a rock up into the air. So there are forces that can act on objects such as to interfere with their natural tendencies. Variation in nature is a product of natural tendencies plus interfering forces. Now, this theory, when it's properly developed, has quite a lot of explanatory power, because we've specified the natural state of objects. So if we find any object that is not in its natural state, then we know to look for some interfering force. So this kind of approach can be applied in many different contexts. Interestingly, Sober says that the natural state model survived in classical Newtonian physics. Consider Newton's first law, which says that an object either remains at rest or continues to move at a constant velocity unless it's acted upon by a net force. The natural state here is the zero force state, and the natural motion of an object is just to continue with whatever motion it has. So for the Aristotelian, the natural state of a rock was to be at the centre, and the natural motion of a rock was to fall downward. For Newton, the natural state of a rock was to be subjected to no net forces, while the natural motion was just continuing in its current state of motion, whatever that may be. This has a lot of explanatory power because it means whenever we observe an object deviate from its previous state of motion, we know that something must have, we know that we need to look for things that could produce a net force on the object. So the natural state model was once applied to biology. we can explain biological variation in terms of natural tendencies plus interfering forces. Consider Aristotle's own view on this. According to Aristotle, in biology, the tendency is for like to produce like. Every living thing has a tendency to produce other things like itself. The exception to this actually is cases of spontaneous generation of living organisms from inanimate matter, which obeys different laws, but we don't really need to go into that here. So no, the general tendency is for like to produce like, or at least more precisely, it's for every male organism has a tendency to produce exact copies of itself. On Aristotle's theory of biological reproduction, the male semen includes a set of instructions which specify the form of the organism. It specifies how the organism should develop. The female provides the matter, which is shaped by these instructions. So the male form shapes the female matter. The natural state of the offspring is to be identical to the male parent, but interfering forces prevent the form from totally mastering the matter. These interfering forces might be trauma or a lack of nutrition or defective matter from the female or whatever. This is why some children end up becoming female, and it's why no child is an exact copy of the father. It's due to interfering forces that prevent natural development. Okay, so according to Sober, the natural state model was accepted by basically everybody in pre-Darwinian biology. Now, of course, people disagreed with the details of Aristotle's own views, but the basic idea that biodiversity is explained by natural tendencies plus interfering forces was accepted by all. Biological variation results from the deviation from the natural type. For Aristotle, the natural state was male and even females were deviations. But the natural state model survives on the assumption that males and females simply have different natural states. So, you know, both the male and the female can be a natural state, but they have different natural states. So just as the laws of physics tell us the natural state of physical objects, so the laws of physics tell us, you know, that the natural state is to continue in their state of motion in the absence of any net force, so the laws governing biological development will specify the natural state of development. Okay, we can apply the natural state model to the species as a whole, not just to development of a single organism. Every species has a particular natural state, a certain ideal type. Each organism within that species has a tendency to develop towards this natural state. Organisms are members of the same species if they exhibit the same natural state. The natural state is the essence. Of course, all species exhibit massive variation. If we look at a given species, we'll find variation in height, in strength, in skin colour, in behavioural skills. Among all of these possible variations, though, there is a privileged state, a natural state, the state to which all members of the species have a tendency to develop. Deviations from that state result from interfering forces. The natural state of human development is to have 4 limbs, but I might have an accident that causes me to lose a limb, and the laws governing the species will specify the natural state of the species and the interfering forces that produce deviations. Now, it's worth noting that the natural state model makes essentialism compatible with gradual variation. Suppose that 2 species seem to blend into each other continuously. Well, it may well be that the natural state, the natural tendencies of these 2 species are still very different. Interfering forces, though, push the members of the species from their natural states, creating the illusion of a lack of boundaries. But this is still a form of essentialism because underlying the continuous variation, there are these discrete natural tendencies. So, that's the natural state model. That's how the essentialist explains variation. And essentialism fails in biology because the natural state model has been discredited. Now, you might initially find this claim a little bit curious, because often people do still think of biology in terms of the natural state model, particularly individual development. It's pretty common for people to think that the genome provides the blueprint of an organism, rather like how an architect's blueprint shows you the design of a building. And then over the organism's development, the organism will approximate this blueprint to a greater or lesser degree, depending on whether or not it's in the right kind of environmental conditions. So the natural state is the state that is specified in the blueprint of the organism. It's specified in the organism's genes. Now, of course, this is just wrong. Modern genetic theory makes no distinction between natural and non-natural states of development. There is no particular path of development that would count as the realization of a natural state. You might want to check out my videos on nature versus nurture for a more detailed discussion of this issue. But the point is that instead what we find in modern genetics is norms of reaction, which specify the various different phenotypes that are produced by a given phenotype in different environments. So consider a phenotypic trait like height. The height of a plant that is produced by a given plant genotype might vary with temperature, with warming temperatures producing a higher plant. And so just imagine that these are the genotypes of two plants, and imagine that you've got sort of temperature along the bottom. As the temperature increases, the height of genotype A increases while the height of genotype B decreases, whatever, right? So the norm of reaction graphs this variation. So suppose we ask, what is the natural height? Well, that's an absurd question. No given height is privileged. All of the heights given in a norm of reaction are as natural as any other. On the natural state model, though, some specific height would be the natural height. So some environment would be the natural environment for that genotype to be in. And this would be the environment that has no interfering forces. There's one type of environment that has no interfering forces, the outcome of which would be the natural height. All other environments have interfering forces. So the height will deviate from the natural height. These distinctions just aren't drawn in modern biology. There is no privileged phenotype. There is no privileged environment. There is no particular class of forces that count as interfering forces. The most we can do today is specify the statistically normal environment, the environment that leads to the average phenotype or whatever. But there's nothing metaphysically special about the normal environment or the normal phenotype. The environment might change. It might become drier or warmer or have a higher concentration of oxygen or whatever. That will lead to different developmental outcomes, but nobody thinks of that as being an interfering force. So that's variation in phenotypes produced by the same genotype. What about variation of genotypes within a species? Well, again, on the natural state model, some specific genotype would be privileged. There is a genotype that is the natural genotype for that species, and other genotypes in the species arise due to interfering forces. This natural genotype would be the essence of the species. Again, modern biology recognises no such distinctions. The modern biologist will simply profile genetic variation in a population and then study how that variation changes over generations. No particular genotype is the natural genotype. An unusual genotype is not a deviation from type. On the contrary, it might actually improve fitness. It might be better than an uncommon gene might be better than the standard gene, and so it may therefore spread through the population. And this, of course, is the basis for Darwinian evolution. The norm in biology is variation. As Sober says, individual differences are not seen by modern biologists as the effects of interfering forces acting on a species' essence, but rather they are seen as being the central causes of the changing properties of the species via the mechanism of natural selection. The individual differences do not result from these interfering forces on a species' essence. They are rather, the individual differences are the causes that sort of produce the overall properties of the species due to selection causing some differences, causing some particular traits to spread through the species. Or to slightly misquote a famous line from Ernst Mayr, we might say that for the essentialist, the species type is real and the variation is an illusion, while for the modern biologist, the type is an abstraction and only the variation is real. So according to Sober, essentialism has been undermined in biology because the kind of explanatory model used by essentialists, the kind of causes that are cited by essentialists in explaining variation just no longer has any application in the field. So, assuming that the arguments against essentialism in biology are correct, what does this mean for essentialism in general? Well, one view here is that this refutes essentialism. This just, essentialism is just no longer plausible. Our best scientific classifications track the natural kinds, but the kinds distinguished by many sciences do not have essences, so essentialism is the wrong account of natural kinds. Species are natural kinds, but species don't have essences, so essentialism is it's just wrong. Possessing essential properties is not what makes a kind a natural kind. An alternative view here is that the essentialist account of natural kinds is correct. It's just that it turns out there are far fewer natural kinds than we might initially have thought. Maybe the only natural kinds are the fundamental particles, or maybe the chemical elements or whatever, but many of our best scientific classification schemes fail to track the natural kinds. Of course, this raises the question of what use the notion of natural kinds has for our understanding of science. Many sciences seem to get by without appealing to natural kinds. Furthermore, recall at the beginning of this video we drew a distinction between natural kinds and purely arbitrary categories. The point is that classification of organisms into species, it's not, that doesn't seem to be arbitrary in the way that, for example, the set of all red objects seems to be. And of course, we're going to have to go beyond essentialism to account for this difference here. Like, what's the difference between the way that we classify all humans into a single species versus how we classify all red objects together? So even if essentialism is defensible in some contexts, it's not the end of the story with respect to kinds. Some kinds don't have essential properties. So in the next video, we will examine some other approaches to natural kinds. But that is all for now. So thank you for watching. Goodbye.